Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're plunging into some really fascinating source material.
We are. We're looking at Ioan Couliano's exploration of Eros and magic in the Renaissance. It's quite a text.
Absolutely. And our premise, as always, is to take something complex like this, maybe a bit daunting, and, unpack its core insights for you.
Give you that shortcut to being well-informed, finding those surprising connections.
Exactly. We want to give you an overview, really highlight what the source material shows as most important about this period.
And this text is just packed with those connections. We're talking love, magic, memory, science, big societal shifts, all interconnected in ways that are pretty surprising from our modern viewpoint.
Yeah, viewed through these concepts of phantasms and the pneuma, it's a whole different way of seeing the world.
It really is. The Renaissance wasn't just, rediscovering old art. It was this intense intellectual ferment where things we separate now.
Like science and magic.
Right. They were deeply intertwined. Sometimes you couldn't even tell them apart. So our goal is to summarize, analyze, pull out the key nuggets.
Help you understand this unique time and also how much it kind of shaped our own world. Which is one of the author's big points, isn't it?
It absolutely is. He draws some really provocative lines to modern thought, modern structures. It definitely challenges that simple idea of inevitable progress.
Okay, let's dive in. We need to start with this core concept, something maybe unfamiliar but foundational, the phantasmic pneuma. Why is this the starting point?
Well, the author is really clear on this. It's not just some obscure historical detail. He argues that if you don't get this concept, you miss the essence, the unity of so many Renaissance spiritual and cognitive processes.
Well, people focusing too much on just Aristotle, maybe.
Exactly. They miss this bigger picture, this underlying mechanism. The pneuma is the key to unlocking their whole worldview, according to Couliano.
So the core idea, just to make sure I'm tracking, is that they believed we had this almost like a physical but subtle internal mechanism, like a processor in our minds.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, an internal processor for taking in the world, forming thoughts, feelings. It wasn't just a metaphor for them. It was their science.
And it had a long history behind it.
Oh, absolutely. A very long lineage. You can trace it back to ancient medical ideas, Sicilian ones apparently, then figures like Diodes of Charistus. Aristotle, of course, developed his own theory of the phantasmic pneuma.
Okay.
Then the Stoics added their idea of the hegemonikon, the sort of principle of the soul. And pneumatic physicians like Archigenes, they kept refining these ideas.
So it wasn't just one source. It was a blend of different ancient streams of thought.
Precisely. And Galen, the famous Roman physician, he was really important here. He built on those pneumatic ideas.
And he's the one who put this control center, the hegemonikon, in the brain.
Yes. Firmly in the brain, not the heart, like some earlier thinkers. And he gave it this crucial job, synesthesis.
Synesthesis, like synthesis.
Exactly. Synthesizing, processing all that pneumatic information coming in. It's where sensory input and internal stuff get brought together, interpreted, integrated.
Okay, so the brain is the hardware for this pneumatic software, basically. How did this ancient idea make it all the way to the Renaissance?
It kind of went underground in the West for a while, but then re-entered mainly through translations of Arab medical works. Thinkers like Constantine the African, Gerard of Cremona.
Translating Avicenna and others.
Right. They made this doctrine pretty commonplace among medieval thinkers. By the 13th century, it was widely accepted. You see it in Albert the Great, Roger Bacon, Thomas Aquinas.
So by the time the Renaissance kicks off, this idea of a pneumatic synthesizer in the brain is already deeply baked into the intellectual cake.
Absolutely, it's part of the toolkit. And Couliano's point is crucial. We have to grasp this continuity to understand what Renaissance thinkers were actually trying to do.
It wasn't just some weird leftover idea.
Not at all. He argues it was a central theme, absolutely fundamental for understanding the mechanics and even the goals of what they considered science. It was, as he puts it, a horizon of hope.
A horizon of hope. That's evocative. Hope for what? What could this mechanism do?
Well, because they believed it was the mechanism for how knowledge was acquired, how internal states were formed, and how they could be influenced.
Okay. Manipulation comes in there too.
Definitely. It's described as this pneumatic synthesizer, acting like a double-faced mirror, reflecting eternal ideas or prototypes from, the soul or higher realms.
And at the same time.
Processing sensory information coming up from the world below.
So it's the bridge between the physical world we sense and the, let's say, spiritual or intellectual world.
That's exactly it. It's seen as the primary body of the soul. It's the place where visions and images, phantasms are formed. It's located right there in the head. So this pneumatic synthesizer, made of this fantasticon pneuma, it's just fundamental. How they knew things, how they perceived things, how feelings worked, how they could be changed. It all came back to this.
Okay, key takeaway. This ancient idea of a pneumatic image processing center in the brain is totally central. It's the engine of their mental and spiritual life. We need to keep that in mind.
Precisely. It's the bedrock for pretty much everything else we're going to discuss.
Which leads us nicely into Eros, love and desire. How does this pneuma and these phantasms connect to how the Renaissance understood love?
Well, they were drawing heavily on Plato, remember? So love was seen primarily as coming from the soul's powers. Physical desire, that was often seen as secondary, maybe a lower aspect, a starting point perhaps.
Like Socrates' whole idea, using attraction as a ladder to climb towards intellectual contemplation.
Exactly that. The Socratic maieutic endeavor, converting all love towards the intellectual. But what's fascinating is that even within this and across different traditions, medieval troubadours, Dante, even Couliano says, echoing in Freud.
Really? Freud too?
In a way. The author points out the central role of phantasms in the preliminaries of desire.
The preliminaries? You mean like the very beginning, the spark?
Yes. The whole process kicks off by setting up a phantasm within the subject. It starts with an image, an internal picture of who or what is desired.
So desire isn't just a bodily thing, it actually originates in the imagination, in this phantasmic realm.
That's the core idea. And Couliano lays out two contrasting paths for Eros, both starting from this phantasm. On one side, you've got spiritual or anagogical Eros. Dante's a classic example.
Right.
Here, the phantasm awakens desire, sure, but then it propels the person upwards towards an intelligential cosmos. The ideal end is ecstatic fusion, like a hunter becoming one with a hunted object. Ficino and Bruno use that image.
So the phantasm is a launch pad to a higher spiritual state. That's one path. What's the other?
The other is natural or vulgar Eros. You see this more in, say, Boccaccio, and Couliano connects it to Freud, too. In this version, the phantasm just points towards a need for physical release.
And the longer you wait,
the stronger that need gets, fueled by the phantasm.
So the very same internal image could lead you on a spiritual quest or just drive a physical urge, depending on how you interpret or direct that phantasm.
Exactly. The author uses Polyphilus's dream from that famous book, The Hypnerotomachia, as an example. Desire is provoked by a phantasm, appeased by a phantasm. And what saves the story from just being, mundane is its phantasmic quality, the power of the image.
That's fascinating. And Ficino, you mentioned him, he had theories about love's effects that involved these invisible forces too, right? Like the evil eye. That wasn't just poetry.
Not for him, no.
Yeah.
His ideas about love's Eros or the evil eye, Jettatura, these were real phenomena for him. He believed they had invisible pneumatic tips that could cause actual harm. Plato himself hinted that love was a kind of sickness of the eyes.
So the idea that just looking at someone could literally affect or wound them was part of this system.
Absolutely. Plutarch talked about sight having a miraculous force. And Ficino's explanation of fascination, the evil eye, ties directly back to the pneuma. He saw it as this force radiating out from the fascinator's spirit, entering the eyes of the person being fascinated and penetrating right to their heart.
Wow. Enters through the eyes, goes to the heart.
Yes. And he believed this force carried spiritual quality, but also, get this, the vapor of the spirit and of tainted blood.
Tainted blood, so it's like a contagion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Spreading a kind of pneumatic contagion. You see how it integrates the physical vapor, blood, with the pneumatic and spiritual. All centered on the power of sight and the phantasmic connection it creates between people.
That's vivid, and it connects perfectly to another key Renaissance practice, the art of memory. How do phantasms play into remembering things?
It's a seamless connection, again, rooted in the phantasmic pneuma. The basic principle is, because our perceptions are inherently phantasmic, they form images in our mind. They're naturally easy to remember. So the art of memory is a technique designed to harness that.
Okay, so it's about taking abstract stuff and deliberately turning it into memorable mental images.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But in a really structured way.
Mm-hmm.
The classic technique involves choosing a specific place, a church, a house, maybe even an imaginary palace.
A memory palace.
Exactly. You memorize its distinct parts in a specific order. Then you take the content you want to remember, a speech, a list of virtues, whatever, and you superimpose it onto those parts. You assign specific, striking images representing the content to specific locations within your mental space.
Right.
The author argues that the imaginary nature of these images, this phantasmic language, creates an indissoluble unity with the words or ideas you're trying to remember. That unity, grounded in the imaginary, is what really locks it into your memory.
So you're leveraging the power of the visual, the phantasmic, to anchor abstract information, building a mental structure for your thoughts.
That's it, exactly. And the Renaissance actually had two main strands of this art of memory. One was purely utilitarian, just focused on remembering practical stuff that often kind of devolved into simpler tricks like mnemonic alphabets or emblems.
Basic memory aids we might still use today, maybe?
Kind of. But the other branch was way more ambitious. It was a continuation of the medieval Lullian tradition. This was seen as a universal art of memory.
Universal? How so?
The goal wasn't just remembering facts. It was to construct an entire inner world of phantasms that could express intelligible realities, the deep truths behind the physical world. The idea was that our world is just a pale copy of these higher realities.
Wow, okay. That's way beyond remembering a shopping list. It's a system for grasping the structure of reality itself.
Totally. And it's based on this core principle. Quid quid recipitur, ad modum recipientis recipitur.
Whatever is received according to the mode of the receiver.
Exactly. And in this context, the human mode of receiving and understanding reality is the phantasm, reflected in that mirror of the pneuma. Couliano argues it was seen as the only way humans could clearly grasp these deeper truths.
So the phantasm isn't just a memory tool, it's fundamental to perception and understanding, especially for non-physical realities.
Yes. It's the necessary bridge. It works both ways. Sensory input translates the outer world into this make-believe language of images for the soul. And understanding deep truths involves translating them into this phantasmic language of images so they can be engraved on the soul and used for reasoning.
It's the common language between abstract truth and human minds.
That's the idea. Ficino's use of hieroglyphs fits here. He saw them as direct symbols of intelligent awareness. And some took it even further, like Giulio Camillo Dominio. He actually tried to build the rules of this phantasmic language into a physical structure. A theater.
A literal wooden theater. For memory.
Yes. A structure he worked obsessively on, even got royal funding for. The idea was you'd physically walk through it, meditating on the images placed in specific locations representing concepts, absorbing the structure of knowledge. It wasn't quite finished, and some people mocked it, but it shows the ambition.
Incredible. A physical building designed as a map of knowledge built with images.
Really captures the spirit. And Couliano highlights this phrase from Ficino, borrowed from Xenophon, that sums up this whole phantasmic approach, whether it's Eros, memory, magic, alchemy. Iucari serio et studiosissime ludere.
Joking seriously and playing assiduously.
Yes. It's about playing with phantasms, engaging seriously with the world of imagination, with images, but doing it with intense focus and diligence. It wasn't just daydreaming, it was a rigorous intellectual game with the highest stakes.
Joking seriously, playing assiduously, that really nails the combination of imagination and intellectual rigor.
It does. It was about using images as a fundamental tool for knowing and connecting with reality.
Okay, let's shift slightly. How does all this pneuma phantasms connect to Neoplatonic ideas about the soul's journey, and specifically melancholy?
Right. This brings in cosmology. The Neoplatonic idea was that souls descend into physical bodies. They come down through the Milky Way, the constellation Cancer.
Okay.
And as they descend, they wrap themselves in this celestial luminous veil, the Odierna. It's like an intermediary layer helping the pure soul connect with the impure earthly body. Couliano notes this celestial vehicle sometimes got confused later with Aristotle's innate pneumatic synthesizer.
Ah, so the soul spacesuit gets mixed up with the body's natural pneuma processor?
Sort of, yeah. That confusion arose. And the point of this whole descent, they believe, was for souls and bodies to kind of confirm or reinforce the 7 original gifts bestowed upon us by God.
Gifts mediated by planets and demons.
Yes, mediated by planets and specific categories of demons associated with them. Now, demons here isn't quite our modern horror movie idea. Think more like intermediaries, forces.
Okay, different context. So give me an example.
Well, the gift of contemplation was thought to be strengthened by Saturn, working through Saturnian demons. Government and empire, that was Jupiter, via Jovian demons. Courage came from Mars through Martian demons and so on. Each planet and its associated beings influence specific human capacities via this pneumatic spiritual link.
Got it. Planetary influences channeled through these intermediaries. Where does melancholy fit?
Melancholy is strongly tied to Capricorn, which is ruled by Saturn, and Saturn was seen as cold, dry, destructive, and melancholic.
Ah, the Saturn connection. So melancholy comes from a specific planetary signature.
Exactly, but it gets more nuanced. The tradition, going back to Theophrastus and Aristotle, actually distinguished between two kinds of melancholy.
Oh.
One came from coal black bile associated with negative stuff, sluggishness, fear, but the other type came from a hot humor, and this kind was linked to genius, creativity, psychic instability, inspiration, even fits of mania or ecstasy, a much more volatile state.
Hot melancholy sounds almost bipolar in modern terms.
There are parallels, maybe, but this hot melancholy, melancholia fumosa, was seen by thinkers like Albert the Great as having this extraordinary compensation.
Compensation, what did it give you?
It resulted in very mobile phantasms, a highly active imagination, and a great capacity for those phantasms to be impressed upon the pneuma. Your internal screen was just highly receptive and dynamic.
So the volatility came with a super-powered imagination and receptivity.
Precisely. And that was linked directly to heightened mental abilities. Prodigious memory, extraordinary analytical skills. This is why Ficino could claim that all the great men who have ever excelled in an art have been melancholic.
Either born that way or became so through intense study.
Exactly. It creates this ambiguity, though. Someone like Henry of Ghent said melancholics couldn't do abstract thought, but Ficino embraced it, identifying them with this Saturnian type. Forced into solitude by their planet, they could reach the highest contemplation, or the depths of perversity.
Divine or bestial.
Right. Ficino said Saturn does not lay down a law concerning the quality and destiny of mortals, but makes a person distinct from others, divine or bestial, happy or oppressed by extreme misery.
A state of heightened potential for good or ill, a double-edged sword.
Totally. It highlights this dual nature. André Chastel suggested Ficino basically invented the modern idea of the romantic genius prone to fits of enthusiasm, furor, and despair, abulia. Interesting precisely because of their dramatic intensity of experience.
It was still seen as a pathology too, right?
Oh, yes. From Hippocrates, Aristotle, right through to Freud, melancholy is also understood as a potential illness, a source of suffering. So it's both potential genius, potential illness tied to this specific temperament and its heightened connection to the phantasmic realm.
And the art of memory, requiring that intense focus and solitude, also fits with this Saturnian melancholic type.
It does seem to align well, yes.
Okay, let's tie all this together now. Pneuma, phantasms, desire, memory, these internal states with magic. The author says love and magic are essentially identical.
That's the core link Couliano highlights, especially in Giordano Bruno's work. Bruno really pushed the identity of love and magic to its logical conclusion, building on Ficino's ideas. And magic, from this Renaissance perspective, isn't about, violating natural laws in a modern sense.
What is it then?
It's defined as a phantasmic process that makes use of the continuity of the individual pneuma and of the universal pneuma.
Okay, say that again. Phantasmic process. Using the continuity.
Right. It works by manipulating the shared pneumatic substance, this subtle medium that connects everyone and everything, and it does this using phantasms, using images.
Okay, so magic is image-based manipulation of this connecting pneuma.
That's the essence. And Bruno uses these terms, binding, vincier, and chains, vincula. That's how he describes the process of magic, and also love.
Binding, chains.
The magician, or the lover, is a hunter of souls, animarum venator. They cast nets, put out phantasmic bait and traps to capture their target.
Hunter of souls.
That's
right. Pretty intense, and the targets can be.
Well, the lover targets the beloved's pneumatic mechanism, trying to influence their feelings using phantasms. But the magician, they can aim wider. Objects, other individuals, society as a whole, even invoking powerful invisible beings, demons, heroes.
Wow.
But it always requires knowing the right nets and bait for that specific target.
And what's the master key, the main chain or net in this system?
Couliano, quoting Bruno, makes it really clear. Sight and hearing. They're secondary gateways for influence. The main entrance, the porta et principios additus, for all magic is fantasia, fantasy, imagination.
Imagination is the main door.
Is the chain of chains, vinculum vinculorum.
The chain of chain. Okay, why? Why is imagination the ultimate key to manipulation?
Because, as Bruno argued, following Aristotle, there is nothing in the intellect that was not previously perceived by the senses. And there is nothing which, coming from the senses, can reach to the intellect without the intermediary of fantasy.
Everything has to pass through the imagination to reach the mind.
Exactly. Our understanding, our internal state, it's all mediated by the images we form. And the power of this imagination, this fantasy, is boosted by our thinking faculty, making it capable of actually subjugating the soul itself.
So if you can control or influence someone's imagination, you can essentially control them, whether it's love magic or political magic.
That's the operating principle.
Okay.
And these chains, these bonds, they're not universal. Bruno stressed that different people need different bonds based on age, looks, gender, personality. He said, semen is of many kinds. Vetus is of many kinds. Love is of many kinds. Bonds are of many kinds.
Tailored manipulation.
Exactly. The operator needs to understand these variations to apply the right chain effectively.
It really sounds like a kind of sophisticated applied psychology, but framed entirely within this pneumatic and phantasmic understanding of reality, believing you could directly impact internal states with these subtle forces.
That's a very good way to put it. D.P. Walker, whose categories Couliano uses, distinguished between subjective magic and transitive magic.
Okay, subjective versus transitive.
Subjective magic is working on yourself, changing your own pneuma to make you better at magic or more influential. It's seen as a kind of preliminary step for all magic. And it's intersubjective too, because the influence bounces back onto the magician.
So self-improvement magic, basically. Training yourself.
In a sense, yes. Transitive magic, then, is aimed outward, acting on the external world, objects, animals, other people. Though Couliano concludes that ultimately all magic is transitive, even if it's just in a closed loop affecting yourself to affect others, because the goal is always change.
Got it. It's becoming much clearer, not just waving wands, but a whole system of influence based on understanding and manipulating these pneumatic, phantasmic connections.
Precisely. And they drew on earlier figures, too, like Synesius and the Arab philosopher Al-Kindi. They recommended using sounds, phonai, substances, hyli, and figures or shapes, schemata, all based on knowing the correspondences between different parts of the universe.
Sounds, substances, figures. How did sound magic work, for instance?
Al-Kindi's theory tied sounds to astrological or elemental correspondences. He believed sounds had inherent power derived from cosmic harmony. To use them magically, you needed intense mental application and representation of the form he wishes to see actualized by the emission of sounds.
So intention and visualization combined with the sound itself?
Yes, and the power was thought to be doubled if the sound's inherent cosmic meaning aligned with its human meaning. This connects to things like Kabbalistic theories about Hebrew being the natural language speaking. Those words could reshape reality.
So sounds weren't arbitrary symbols. They could hold real inherent power if you knew how to unlock it.
That was the belief. Magic shapes and characters worked similarly. Even sacrifice fit into this system. Al-Kindi saw killing an animal, a microcosm, as creating a kind of rip in the fabric of the macrocosm, allowing the magician's will to enter and influence events.
That definitely adds a darker shade to it.
It does, but it wasn't always about manipulation in a negative sense. There was also a strong focus on pneumatic purging.
Purging, like cleaning.
Exactly. Purifying your own human spirit to make it more compatible with the spirit of the world, more heavenly. This meant getting rid of filth, not just from your food, but from your soul, your skin, your clothes, your house, the air around you. Synesius talks about this a lot.
So personal hygiene and spiritual cleanliness were part of making yourself a better conduit for these pneumatic forces, clearing your internal channels.
That's exactly the idea. Theurgic practices coming from texts like the Chaldean oracles also focused on purification, often using material rites, stones, herbs, incantations to strengthen the soul's vehicle, that odierna, and help it ascend towards God. It wasn't just internal meditation. It was using physical means to affect the pneumatic and spiritual.
A mix of ritual and internal discipline, all aimed at refining the pneuma.
Right, and there was this ancient focus, especially from the East, like the Upanishads, on purification of the heart. Indian philosophy developed intricate ideas about bodily energies, pranas, connecting them to emotions, with the heart as a key center.
The heart again. I thought the pneuma synthesizer was in the brain.
It was primarily, but the heart was seen as the seat of sensibility, of emotions. This early focus got transformed by Indian philosophy and Greek medicine into seeing the heart as crucial for life and communication. And crucially, visionary activity, the manifestation of phantasms, wasn't just in the head. It could happen in the heart's ethereal cavity, the very center of the subtle organism.
So phantasms could manifest in the heart too?
Yes. Couliano points to all those English idioms we still use, hard heart, heart of stone, pure heart, heart and mouth, heart of gold, as reflecting this deep, perhaps extra-linguistic truth about the heart's perceived emotional and moral significance.
That's a great point. We still talk that way. It shows how these old ideas linger in our language, that view of the heart as the core of feeling and character.
Absolutely. This idea of phantasms manifesting in the heart shows how integrated their view of the subtle organism was. Body and spirit weren't sharply divided. Couliano gives this great anecdote, sort of a composite picture of what a fear-just life might look like.
Oh yeah, what would they do day to day?
Well, it was very structured. A daily walk, maybe in a special garden, carefully avoiding negative encounters that could mess with their pneumatic state. Rhythmic breathing exercises to control internal energies. Playing music like the lyre to attract good planetary vibes for Paul. Apollo, the graces.
Okay.
Diet was key. Frugal, maybe vegetables, lettuce, but also specific things like maybe 2 rooster hearts.
Rooster hearts, why?
To strengthen his heart through sympathy. Maybe a sheep's brain for his brain. Linking food directly to reinforcing specific organs and their pneumatic qualities.
Wow, specific dietary magic. What else?
Maybe some white sugar for sweetness, wine with ground amethyst to draw Venus's influence, and meticulous cleanliness, washing thoroughly, maybe twice a day, way more than most people then. Believing this physical pneumatic purging made his spirit more heavenly, more aligned with the world spirit.
It sounds like an incredibly ritualized, symbolically dense life. Every little action aimed at tuning yourself to these cosmic and pneumatic frequencies.
That was the goal. It was about absorbing the gifts of the animate world and the gifts of the living stars, things naturally full of pneuma to feed your own spirit through this pneumatic solidarity. Incorporating that quinta essentia, the fifth essence, through diet, ritual, lifestyle.
And this relied heavily on knowing planetary influences, right? Like a Ficino and the Picatrix detailed.
Hugely. Each planet linked to specific qualities, activities, Saturn for philosophy and occultism, Jupiter for politics, Venus for parties, etc. Also linked to body parts, specific remedies, talismans.
And timing was everything.
Crucial. Finding the opportune times, the tempora opportuna, based on planetary positions for rituals. Ficino said it flat out. Natural things, as well as artificial things, have occult qualities conferred upon them by the stars. Through these things, our spirit attracts the influence of the respective stars. It was this whole system of cosmic sympathy.
A comprehensive map of influences you had to navigate. Which brings us squarely to Giordano Bruno. Couliano positions him as the central figure embodying this whole phantasmic past.
Bruno is absolutely pivotal in Couliano's analysis. People often label him a Neoplatonic pantheist, which he was, in part. But Couliano argues his core, his foundation, is deep in the arcana of this era of phantasms, mnemotechnics, the art of memory and magic.
And that's why he was so misunderstood later.
Exactly. His way of thinking, so reliant on images, on manipulating imagination, was just alien to the later rationalist age. Hegel called him bacchantic, wild, unrestrained.
He was definitely controversial, clashed with the church. But Couliano says he belonged culturally to the past, not the future, like, say, the Protestants.
Right. His iconoclasm was different. It came from within this older framework. You see this intensity in works like his heroic furors.
Heroic furors. Tell me about that one.
Well, he apparently first thought of calling it a canticle, but changed the title, probably to avoid sounding like he was just writing about ordinary love. It's basically lyrical metaphysics, but presented using the art of memory.
So it's philosophy taught through memory techniques.
Yes. It's structured like a course in the art of memory. He uses these symbolic images, impresa, to represent the stages of love and spiritual ascent, and then explains them in sonnets and commentary. The reader was meant to use mnemonic techniques to internalize the images and thus grasp the ideas.
Like learning through symbolic pictures you embed in your mind. What's a key image from it?
Well, a central one, especially in his English dialogues written around the same time, is the allegory of Actaeon and Diana.
The hunter who surprises the goddess bathing gets turned into a stag and his own dogs eat him. Ouch. How does Bruno use that?
It's incredibly dense, a core mnemonic statue for his system. Diana herself is a multi-layered symbol, an artificial memory image. She represents nature, the moon, and, significantly first time in England, Queen Elizabeth.
Wow, okay. Nature, moon, Queen Elizabeth, all wrapped in one image.
Yes. As nature universe, she's the source of forms, like Amphitrite. As the moon, she reflects the sun, which is divinity. Her visible parts, the bust and the statue, symbolize divine power and beauty, accessible through contemplation, represented by materials like alabaster for beauty, purple for power, gold for wisdom.
A really complex symbolic package. So what about poor Actaeon?
Actaeon is the mnemonic statue of the seeker. The subject trying to find truth, using all his faculties, sense, imagination, reason. He's also a social being, with limits. When he gets turned into a stag, that's the moment of revelation, seeing the goddess nature naked, seeing truth unveiled.
Okay, but then he gets eaten by his dogs.
Right. The dogs represent his own thoughts, his own seeking mind, now aimed at the highest truth. They turn on him, consume his former self. It's about the transformation, even the destruction of the subjective self in the face of ultimate reality.
The hunter becomes the hunted, consumed by his own pursuit of knowledge. That's powerful.
It is. It echoes Ficino's ideas about losing yourself in the object of contemplation. One is not dead because one lives in the objects. One is not alive because one is dead within oneself. And Pico's mystical death kiss. Bruno packed all this into the Actaeon Dian image, using a language familiar to those trained in memory arts, linking it to the queen perhaps for favor, but fundamentally to teach metaphysics and mnemonics.
And this ties back to his ideas on magic and manipulation, too.
Absolutely. Remember the binding in chains. He hammers home that Eros sensual pleasure. Fantasy is the vincularum, the ultimate chain for influencing others.
Imagination and desire as the master keys.
Yes. He even discusses, some ambiguously, these folk practices linked to sorcerers using ointments and herbs to create, essentially, artificial semen and induce phantasmic sexual pleasure. Couliano suggests Bruno saw this as another way phantasms could be generated, perhaps even disruptively, to influence internal consciousness. It reinforces that the imagination was the prime target.
So Bruno really embodies this whole complex world. Memory, magic, Eros, philosophy, all interwoven through the power of phantasms and the manipulation of the imagination.
He's the quintessential figure of that phantasmic culture, according to Couliano.
Okay, this leads us into the darker side, perhaps. The world of demons. We touched on them with the soul's descent, but how did they fit into magic and, crucially, the witch craze?
Right. The Neoplatonists, as we said, saw different kinds of demons, some good, some bad. But the Christian Platonist, Michael Psellos, made a big shift.
Yeah.
He considered all demons evil.
All of them. That really changes the dynamic. What were they like, according to Psellos?
He described them having these tenuous pneumatic bodies, dim, not glowing like angels, and drawing on older sources, he got quite specific, even graphic. Demons could ejaculate semen.
Really?
Yeah, borrowed in animal bodies. They had limbs. They ate spirit and body fluids. They even defecated. They were seen as semi-physical beings, incredibly numerous, filling the air, earth, sea.
That's a very corporeal view of demons, almost biological.
It is. Psellos listed 6 categories: igneous, aerial, terrestrial, aquatic, subterranean, and light-fleeing dark. While all were evil, the first 3 sublunar, aerial, terrestrial, were seen as primarily acting spiritually.
How so?
By depraving the soul by means of fantasies and cogitations, especially provoking erotic fantasies. The others could be more materialistic, and because they were pneumatic, they could shapeshift, assume deceptive forms.
So demons were believed to directly mess with your imagination, to use phantasms to tempt and corrupt you.
That was exactly the belief. They were seen as actively manipulating that internal pneuma, using images as their main tool. And this provides a really chilling backdrop for understanding the great witch craze in the 16th and 17th centuries.
The witch craze, a truly terrifying time. How did these demon beliefs fuel the persecution?
Well, key texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, Boden's Demona Meni, they were filled with supposed accounts of witches having sex with demons, incuba for female witches, succuba for male sorcerers, even necrophilia with corpses animated by devils.
Horrifying.
Stories like one from Jordanes de Bergamo, about a man supposedly having a succubus mistress for 15 years, were presented as proof of these pneumatic, semi-physical demonic encounters.
So the belief that demons had these subtle bodies and could interact physically, especially sexually, directly fed the accusations against witches.
Absolutely. And the things associated with witches, like ointments and broomsticks, were interpreted through this lens. The names they were called Pixidaria, ointment users, Bacularia, broomstick users, point to this. And when you look at the recipes for these flying ointments,
What was in them?
powerful hallucinogens, plants like datura, belladonna, henbane, stuff that could definitely induce intense visions and altered states.
So people were possibly having drug-induced hallucinations, and these experiences were being interpreted as consorting with demons.
That's a strong possibility. And these ointments were believed to be absorbed through the skin, especially sensitive areas like, well, the vulva or armpits, which might explain the broomstick imagery as an applicator. Bruno himself, as we mentioned, talked about similar folk practices, using unguents for phantasmic effects. It suggests this link between substances, altered states, and the imagination was recognized, but interpreted demonologically.
And the imagery associated with witches, the engravings and such.
Couliano points out how often it bordered on the pornographic. He argues that while the official purpose was to warn people, the imagery actually served as an outlet, projecting the repressed inhibitions and forbidden desires of the persecutors onto the accused.
Projecting their own fears and fantasies onto the witches.
Exactly. Even something like an untidy appearance could make a woman suspect. There's an anecdote about a disheveled woman being asked where she's going and snapping back, "To hell, to kindle the fire under you." It shows attention.
That's a powerful psychological reading of the craze. It wasn't just about the accused. It reflected the accuser's own internal conflicts, projected outwards onto marginalized figures.
Yes, and Couliano is careful to distinguish this from, say, schizophrenia. He refutes the idea of magic as just institutionalized schizophrenia.
How so?
He argues that true magicians, unlike schizophrenics, usually know their phantasmagoria works only within the realm of human imagination. They maintain that awareness. Bruno warned about the dangers of manipulating phantasms, how it could lead to collective mental illness if that line was lost. The magician knows it's a technique. The schizophrenic loses that boundary.
That's an important distinction. Okay, let's turn to another figure steeped in this world of occult knowledge and perceived supernatural dealings. Abbot Johannes Trithemius.
Trithemius is fascinating. His whole career seemed based on this idea of close collaboration with supernatural forces. He had a rough start, but a vision supposedly led him towards focusing on images, implying magic.
And he became an abbot really young.
Very young. But his big claim to fame was creating this absolutely incredible library at Sponheim Monastery. Started with just 48 books, ended up with almost 2,000 rare occult manuscripts and texts in about 2 decades.
2,000 occult volumes in the early 1500s. That's unbelievable. A real center for this phantasmic knowledge.
It was unique. Trithemius himself boasted about it, saying he'd never seen or heard of such a library, full of rare, hidden, secret, and wondrous books you couldn't find anywhere else.
What kind of stuff was likely in there?
Well, based on a later book he wrote, the Antipalus Maleficarum, which he wrote after going back to Sponheim specifically to jog his memory about occultism, it almost certainly had countless grimoires, books on demon magic, necromancy, astrological magic, things like the Key of Solomon, the Picatrix, Sephiroth.
The heavy hitters of the magical tradition. No wonder people thought he was a sorcerer.
Exactly. And that legend really took off after a cryptic letter he wrote to a friend was discovered after the friend died suddenly. It raised a lot of eyebrows.
Cryptic like his book Steganography.
Precisely. Steganography presented itself as a method for secret, long-distance communication using spirits or angels, like Saturn's angel or Raphael.
How is it supposed to work?
You'd make an image of the spirit wax, or drawing, say, specific prayers, put it somewhere specific, and the spirit would transmit your message. Apparently, the recipient could use it too, and you could reuse it for different people just by changing the name in the ritual.
Magical telegraphy via angels. But Couliano says there was a hidden message, a bigger goal, encoded in the book itself.
Yes. By taking just the capital letters from the text, Couliano reveals Trithemius' hidden claim. And all things which are done in the world, observing the constellation by this art, you'll be able to know.
Know everything happening in the world. That's more than just sending messages. That sounds like divination.
Exactly, which is foretelling the future. And that lands us back in tricky theological territory. Remember Paul Gerlani's point? Invoking demons by command was sacrilegious, maybe, but not outright heresy. But predicting the future, that was always heretical.
Okay. So Trithemius' hidden goal, the real power of his art, was actually heretical divination.
That's the implication. And Couliano suggests this is probably why the third book of Steganography was either never finished or deliberately destroyed. Trithemius likely knew the danger, knew the distinction, and burned the evidence related to divination to avoid a heresy charge, even if he thought the method worked.
Self-preservation. Makes sense.
Plausible, anyway. And the book was put on the Church's index of prohibited books for centuries. Couliano contrasts Trithemius' reputed success with Cornelius Agrippa's documented failures trying to get spirits to help him, having to resort to biblical spells. It suggests Trithemius' method, this cooperation with powerful planetary demons via pneumatic transmission, was considered the real deal within that framework.
Wow. Trithemius, with his library, secret communication, his ambition to know everything, he really embodies that intersection of knowledge, magic, and the perceived supernatural, all working through pneuma and phantasms.
He's a perfect example.
So this brings us to the really big picture question Couliano wrestles with, the historical enigma. Why did modern science suddenly emerge and seemingly sweep away all these Renaissance sciences, astrology, magic, alchemy, which were built on phantasms and pneuma and were apparently flourishing and working within their own context?
It is a puzzle. The standard story is just, well, modern science was better, truer, and destined to win. But Couliano challenges that simplistic view. He argues Renaissance sciences weren't necessarily useless or impractical in their time. He sees modern science not as inherently superior, but provocatively as a kind of wingless fly.
A wingless fly.
Explain that analogy.
He calls it an aberrant product of nature, maybe even a sick mutation. It survived, he argues, not because it was better in all possible worlds, but because of specific environmental accidents, the fierce whirlwinds of the 16th century.
These upheavals, Couliano says, hit the Renaissance sciences, based on phantasms, so hard that they were effectively wiped out through natural selection. This cleared the way for the wingless fly of modern science, which operated differently, to survive and take over in the new, much harsher environment.
So modern science didn't necessarily win on merit alone, but because the massive disruptions of the 16th century killed off its competition. That's a radical take.
It's very provocative, like wingless flies evolving on a windy island. The ones with wings get blown away, the mutants survive. It completely reframes the idea of a smooth, inevitable march towards modern scientific truth.
What were these fierce whirlwinds specifically then? What caused such disruption?
Couliano points to a convergence of factors, really kicking off around the year 1484. That year was hugely significant for astrologers because of major planetary conjunctions.
1484. Why was that year so charged?
It goes back to these old theories of planetary conjunctions, from figures like Al-Kindi and Al-Bumassar. You had small ones every 20 years, but great ones every 960 years. Believed to trigger huge shifts in nature, politics, religion, start new eras. Roger Bacon even linked them to the birth of major prophets every 320 years or so.
So 1484 was astrologically predicted to be a massive turning point, the start of something new?
Exactly. Across Europe, astrologers like Paul of Middelburg, Johannes Lichtenberger, they were expecting a little prophet to emerge around 1484, thanks to a conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter in Aquarius. This prophet would supposedly bring a radical new understanding of scripture or new religious practices.
A predicted prophet, timed by the stars, ready to shake up religion.
That was the expectation. But 1484 was also linked to other major upheavals. It was used astrologically to explain the arrival of syphilis, the French disease, which swept across Europe after seemingly arriving from the Americas.
So a terrifying new epidemic was also tied astrologically to that same pivotal year, connecting cosmic events and earthly disasters.
Yes. Astrologers like Grunpeck gave explanations linking it to Jupiter, its rulership over France, its hot humid nature. And crucially, 1484 is also the year Pope Innocent VIII issued his bull, Summis Desiderantes Affectibus.
The papal bull, often seen as kicking off the intensified witch craze.
Exactly. While the systematic hunts peaked later, and were often driven by secular authorities with Reformation influence, this bull is seen as a key starting signal. And it came about because Pope Innocent had met with Henry and Sertorius, the driving force behind the Malleus Maleficarum.
So 1484 becomes this focal point, astrological prophecy of change, a new devastating disease explained by the stars, and the papal green light for hunting witches. It really does feel like the start of those fierce whirlwinds.
It's presented as this moment where multiple anxieties and forces for radical change converge, signaling a profound shift was underway.
And among those whirlwinds, Couliano singles out the Reformation as playing the decisive killer blow to the phantasmic culture and the Renaissance sciences built on it.
Yes. His argument is stark. The Reformation, by fundamentally attacking phantasms, by declaring them idolatrous and impious, essentially abolished at one stroke the culture of the Renaissance.
Idolatrous and impious. Why view phantasms, images, imagination that way?
Because they were products of human imagination, potentially unreliable, potentially influenced by demons, leading away from true, unmediated faith in God and Scripture. By condemning them, the Reformation directly undercut the foundation of Renaissance astrology, magic, memory arts, all heavily reliant on interpreting and manipulating phantasms. These practices just couldn't withstand that theological assault.
And the Catholic Church didn't push back. The Counter-Reformation didn't defend the Renaissance way.
Surprisingly, no, not really. Couliano argues the Counter-Reformation, despite being an internal Catholic movement, actually absorbed much of the spirit of the Reformation in this regard. It moved towards greater severity, suspicion of images, and effectively cut ties with the more open, phantasm-friendly culture of the earlier Renaissance. Both sides, in a way, ended up rejecting that core element.
So the major religious forces, Protestant and Catholic, both turned against this phantasmic worldview, this integration of imagination, nature, and spirit.
Largely, yes. And this profound shift in mentality, Couliano argues, is key to understanding controversies like the one over Copernicus. It wasn't just about astronomy, it was a clash of fundamental worldviews.
How so?
The old geocentric system, the earth-centered one, reflected in scripture like Ecclesiastes, the sun rises, the sun sets, it just felt right. It matched everyday experience. It was comforting. It put humanity at the center.
It made intuitive sense and gave us a secure place in the cosmos.
Right. The heliocentric system, the sun-centered one. Astronomically, Couliano says it was child's play compared to the complex Ptolemaic model. It could even been used to reinforce theology, yet it faced huge resistance. Why?
Not because it was wrong scientifically, but...
Couliano argues the resistance came largely from finding it practical not to disturb peace of mind by hypotheses which were too daring. Protect the established worldview, protect psychological comfort, rather than embrace a potentially destabilizing truth.
That sounds more like the Puritan mindset you mentioned, prioritizing stability, scriptural authority, avoiding things that might cause spiritual anxiety.
Exactly. Couliano links it to a Puritan feel of becoming estranged from God. Looking too closely at how the world worked scientifically felt dangerous, like it might contaminate faith. So they hardened traditional attitudes.
A desire to protect faith by keeping science, and maybe nature itself, at arm's length.
That's the dynamic Couliano describes. He argues Puritanism, trying to save the soul from the world, paradoxically ended up pushing God out of the world. By insisting on God's absolute transcendence, his total separateness from nature and human imagination, they removed his presence from where Renaissance thinkers saw him everywhere, in nature's patterns, cosmic harmonies, the power of images. This rejection of an immanent God present in the world had huge consequences.
And Couliano sees this playing out in later thinkers.
Yes. He points to Pascal and Nietzsche as key examples, exponents of this Puritan revolution spirit. Pascal's famous terror before the infinite silence of space. Couliano calls it metaphysically and existentially antipodal to the infinite universe of someone like Cousa or Bruno, where the infinite wasn't terrifying because God was present in it, everywhere.
So Pascal's dread comes from this new vision of a vast, empty universe with a distant, silent God.
That's the argument. Pascal's message, God's infinite transcendence, the rejection of pantheism, embodies this Puritan shift. Couliano even compares Pascal to Nietzsche in their shared nihilistic activity against the old Renaissance Platonic cosmos, that integrated world of spirit and matter.
So the angst of Pascal, the God is dead of Nietzsche. These are downstream consequences of that 16th century rupture, that expulsion of God from the world of nature and imagination.
That's Couliano's provocative thesis. Pascal's anguish stemmed, he suggests, not just from the science, but fundamentally from being a Puritan, from clinging to this idea of an abstract, distant God absent from the world.
And this also changed how people viewed human freedom.
Profoundly. Contrast Pico della Mirandola's Renaissance celebration of free will. Our freedom lets us ascend, choose our place, connect with higher beings, with the later anguish of someone like Kierkegaard.
How did it change?
When God withdraws into total transcendence, becomes utterly separate, Couliano argues human liberty loses its reference points. Without that cosmic hierarchy to climb, without God's immanent presence as a guide, freedom becomes a terrifying burden, an anchorless state. The silence of God up there leads to the silence of nature down here.
The silence of nature, because nature was no longer seen as filled with divine signs, as a book to read God's presence in.
Exactly. Reading the book of nature was central to Renaissance epistemology. The Reformation, broadly speaking, wanted to close that book, or at least interpret it only through the narrow lens of Scripture. Why? Because nature itself became suspect.
Suspect how?
It was seen not as a path to God, but as a source of alienation, temptation, sin. The great culprit in this view was sinning nature.
So nature itself, the physical world, became tainted, something to be wary of, controlled, maybe even overcome, rather than embraced as sacred or revelatory.
That's the fundamental shift in attitude. And it had massive implications for how society viewed the body, and particularly women.
Ah, yes, the connection to women. How did this changing view of nature impact attitudes towards women?
Well, the old identification was strong. Woman Elia, man a culture spirit. This was common in the Middle Ages and hammered home by texts like the Malleus Maleficorum, calling woman evil of nature.
A deeply misogynistic framing.
Terribly so. And the consequence was, the more naturally beautiful or fertile woman seemed, the more spiritually suspect she became. Why? Because beauty meant power to seduce, to awaken sexual desire, which was seen as defilement, pulling man down into sinning nature. The ideal became the beauty of virtue, often expressed through suppressing or despising the physical body.
So natural female beauty became a spiritual danger zone.
Yes. Now, the Renaissance itself had moments of greater openness, more appreciation for the body. Fashion revealed more. Mixed bathing happened. Folk dances, erotic literature like Boccaccio, Rabelais, Bruno. Art changed, too, celebrating the human form in a new way.
A period of relative relaxation around the body and nature.
It seems so. But this reversed sharply after the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. Fashion became incredibly severe, especially in places like Spain by the 18th century. Women literally flattening their breasts with lead plates, wearing long, concealing skirts, high shoes.
Lead plates to flatten breasts? That's extreme. A literal suppression of natural form.
It shows the intensity of the reaction, the drive to control and suppress the body, especially female nature. Couliano links this directly to the witch figure.
Yeah.
In this repressive climate, only the witch dared to embody natural features, prominent hips, breasts, long hair. She became the image of the natural, anticonformist, and destructive temptress.
So embracing your natural body became almost an act of rebellion associated with witchcraft because nature itself was condemned.
That's the dynamic. Contrasted with the ideal of the rigid, uniform figure and emaciated face of the virtuous Spanish woman, whose body was disciplined into conformity.
And this loops back to the witch imagery being pornographic.
Yes. Couliano argues it became the dumping ground for the era's repressed desires. The persecutors poured their own forbidden fantasies, their own fear and fascination with sinning nature onto the accused witches, projecting their internal conflicts onto these marginalized women.
It's a chilling feedback loop. Condemn nature, suppress the body, project repressed desires onto those who seem natural, then persecute them.
It paints a very dark picture of the psychological fallout from that ideological shift.
Let's try to bring these threads together by looking at the Faust legend. Couliano sees it as a kind of mirror reflecting this central conflict.
Yes, the Faust story, with its roots in Simon Magus and St. Cyprian of Antioch, perfectly encapsulates this tension. The core plot, especially in versions like Calderon's play, involves the seeker Cyprian or Faust desiring the beautiful Justina or Faustina.
And she's Christian, vowed to chastity, representing the spiritual path.
Exactly. And her character holds the duality. She is Faustina, natural, beautiful, and object of desire created by nature. But she's also Justina, Christian, aspiring to a transcendent, a cosmic state. It's the conflict between her natural destiny and her chosen spiritual path.
Nature versus spirit, body versus transcendence, all in one character.
Precisely. And how does the devil try to win her in Calderon's version? He sees her as Faustina, as nature, as inherently sinful. So he uses the exact techniques of erotic magic we've discussed.
Acting on her imagination.
Yes. He tries to manipulate her fantasies, sending erotic phantasms, using magic incantations with lascivious spirits to awaken her dormant natural being, her femininity. He's following the rules of Ficino and Bruno. Target the imagination, considering the subject's nature.
So the devil is literally employing Renaissance phantasmic magic. Does it work?
No, he fails.
Why? If phantasmic magic is so powerful at manipulating the imagination.
Because, Couliano argues, the devil underestimated Justina's Christian faith, and crucially, her free will. He points to a contemporary theological text by Cardinal Toledo that stated free will itself cannot be influenced, only the imagination can. The devil succeeded in flooding her imagination with tempting phantasms, but he couldn't break her freely chosen commitment to her faith.
So the story becomes a demonstration of the limits of phantasmic magic. It can sway the imagination, but it can't compel the will against genuine faith. That's fascinating.
It perfectly frames the clash. The worldview based on manipulating the imaginative natural realm through phantasms, represented by the devil using magic, versus the worldview based on transcendent faith and inviolable free will, represented by Justina. The latter triumphs.
Which brings us to the endgame. How did this historical conflict, this shift away from the phantasmic culture, shape the modern world we actually live in?
Couliano argues the consequences are profound and ongoing. He mentions Glauber, a chemist working during the devastating 30 Years' War. Glauber had this vision of Germany achieving global dominance through military and economic power, fueled by science. And he started developing chemical weapons, acid, pressure tubes. Chemical weapons in the 17th century, moving warfare into the lab.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Shifting the focus of power and conflict from the battlefield or even magical influence to the laboratory. Couliano connects this directly to our time, saying Glauber correctly foresaw modern warfare, which no longer takes place on the ground, but only in the laboratories of the great powers. This shift towards technological manipulation is seen as a direct legacy of the era that rejected the older phantasmic ways.
That's a stark connection between a 17th century chemist's vision and the 21st century.
And Couliano's overall conclusion is bleak. Our civilization continues to die in the trenches dug by the Reformation and by the political events that followed it. He echoes Nietzsche, seeing the modern West as a fatal result of the Reformation, dying in those trenches, suggesting we're still trapped in the conflicts born from that historical rupture, that rejection of the phantasmic, the closing of nature's book.
That's the strong implication. A sense of fragmentation, loss, ongoing neurosis stemming from that divide, which leads him to his final, really provocative question.
Which is
this it? Is this the final outcome? Or is a new renaissance possible? A rebirth that could heal our modern neuroses, all conflicts and all divisions?
a new renaissance emerging from the ashes of the phantasmic culture. What would allow that?
Couliano states the condition clearly. It would require a new reformation, another profound shift, but this time one that fundamentally modifies human imagination again, impressing upon it other paths and other goals, not just tinkering, but a deep change in how we imagine and relate to the world.
So just as the first Reformation destroyed the phantasmic culture, a new kind of Reformation, focused on reimagining our imagination, is needed for rebirth.
That's his proposition. But he leaves us with this unsettling final thought. Will this new reformation, this necessary upheaval of imagination, seem friendly and benign to those who experience its upheavals?
Friendly or benign, or disruptive and terrifying, like the first one must have been for many? That's a heavy question to end on.
It implies that profound transformation, even if ultimately positive or necessary, is rarely comfortable. It's experienced as disruption, as upheaval, by those living through it.
Wow, what a sweep. From the subtle mechanics of the pneuma and phantasms in the Renaissance mind, through love, magic, memory, melancholy, the terrifying witch craze, Bruno's complex system, Trithemius' secrets, and then this dramatic, history-altering shift driven by the Reformation, reshaping our view of nature, imagination, the body, ourselves, leading right up to our modern condition.
It really underscores how interconnected it all was, revolving around the central axis of the phantasmic pneuma and the power ascribed to imagination, and how radically things changed when that axis was broken, setting Western civilization on a completely different trajectory. One, Couliano argues, we're still grappling with.
Well, hopefully this deep dive has given you, our listeners, some unexpected insights, maybe some new ways to think about that period and its surprising connections to our own time. A shortcut, perhaps, to understanding a really complex and crucial transformation.
And it certainly leaves us, as Couliano does, pondering that final question. If our world is a product of that past upheaval and a new reformation of imagination is needed for any kind of renaissance, what would that actually feel like to live through?
Friendly or disruptive. Definitely something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.